Samstapakaya Dharmasya Sarva Dharma Swarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. O Ram Krishna, establishment of the eternal religion, the embodiment, in fact, of all religions. To thee, the noblest of divine incarnations, I offer my salutations. Well, good evening and welcome to this special occasion. 3 occasions, of course, are available this evening. Today, of course, was the 1st of April, and there is a tradition in Ireland that a victim is given a letter, and it's addressed to a certain person, and the person opens the letter, and the letter says, "Send the fool further," and he gives the letter back to the victim, and so it goes on and on and on. In other countries, it's to do with other things, but April the 1st reminds us, I suppose, if we want a spiritual orientation on everything, that perhaps we're all a little foolish. We're all pilgrims on a certain journey, in a certain direction, and we learn. Even the highest and best of us will do so. And so today, of course, we're celebrating the Titi Puja of the great apostle of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Yogananda. Now, unlike most of the other apostles, Swami Yogananda, who also we learn lessons from in terms of when he was under the tutelage of Sri Ramakrishna. But we know not much about Swami Yogananda in comparison, maybe, to the other apostles of Sri Ramakrishna. And he led a very, very short life, actually. He was the first of the apostles to leave this mortal frame, but he was specifically identified as Ishvara Koti, that is, somebody who is an eternal, perfect companion, a group of select devotees who accompany the incarnation on each advent of each incarnation. And the other celebration, of course, today would be what is called Maundy Thursday. And that also has a significance. The early monks, the monastic disciples of Ramakrishna, when they met at the Baranago monastery, they used to study a number of different texts. Among these texts would have been the Vedas, obviously, the Bible, Imitation of Christ, and other scriptures. One day, they read a passage from the Bible, for there are some eunuchs which were born, also born from their mother's womb, and maybe eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. And just to remind ourselves of the companionship and fraternal feeling that each of the early monastic disciples had for each other, they made fun of this. Someone jokingly called Yogananda a eunuch. There's a story behind that, of course. But he replied, "You'll see, just wait. Jesus left a group of eunuchs who shook the whole world, and we'll do the same thing." On another occasion, Yogananda mentioned the main teaching of Christ to his disciples. And we don't have any teachings per se documented of Swami Yogananda. But this can be considered his teaching and a central teaching, because he came across this. Christ has said to his disciples, "Love one another." And to realize that one sentence, he said, is equivalent to studying the whole Bible. We may say even the whole of all scriptures. What a wonderful teaching. We could probably spend hours together discussing and analyzing this particular teaching. Love one another. Is it easy to love one another? What is the basis of loving one another? And Maundy Thursday, apart from anything else, celebrating the Last Supper, the last meal, which took on some liturgical significance later, was a fraternal meeting of the apostles, the Last Supper that they would have, the last fraternal meal that they would enjoy together. And during that period of time, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. Now, in most Christian churches on today, they have the priest or the bishop or the pope or whatever it is washing the feet of the disciples, washing the feet symbolically of 12 men representing this act. It's a wonderful, wonderful lesson in divine inspiration, humility, and service. And Yogananda had a very soft heart. He was a very good-looking person. Swami Shivananda, his Gurubai, registers this about him. He says Swami Yogananda was a highly evolved soul. He was extremely handsome and had a manly body. Once he was traveling in Central Province and he was alone in a train car. At a particular station, when the train was about to leave, a beautiful courtesan hurriedly got into the same car with her luggage. And as soon as her eyes fell on Yogananda, she was infatuated, and she begged him, "I offer me everything to you, please accept me." And when Yogananda did not respond, she became impatient and threatened him, "If you don't listen to me right now, I shall pull the alarm chain to stop the train, and I shall complain to the guard that you had molested me." And she was carrying a bottle of wine in her bag, and she began to drink the wine to become more excited. But it had the opposite effect, and she became so drunk that she passed out on her seat. When the train reached the next station, Yogananda got off the train unharmed. Look what the grace of the Master. Who else can protect except he says. From childhood, Swami Yogananda, or Yogin as he was called, he was born in 1861. He was very ascetic from the very beginning. Since he was this Ishwara Koti, we can see evidence of his internal nature, his quiet nature, his shyness almost, his painful shyness indeed. And so he didn't make that many friends. His moods would often be highly spiritual. But he encountered Sri Ramakrishna in a very peculiar way. Of course, he lived and was brought up near Dakshinaswar, where Ramakrishna was living and staying. And he had heard about Ramakrishna, but he often frequented the Dakshinaswar temple, picking flowers, and on one occasion he went. And he came from a very aristocratic family, but he wasn't prepared to meet the reputed madman called Sri Ramakrishna. Anyway, he saw some flowers at Dakshinaswar, and he saw a gardener, or he presumed he was the gardener, and he said, "Hey, please pick some flowers for me and give them." And the gardener happily did it. About 2-3 years later, at the age of 16, Yogananda was curious. He had heard about Sri Ramakrishna through the Brahma Samaj publications. And he decided, let me go and meet the man. And so he stood shyly outside Ramakrishna's room's door. And there were some people inside, and Ramakrishna had said, please bring the other people who are outside, bring them in. But the only person standing outside was Yogin. He brought him in, and what was Yogin's surprise? There before him, Sri Ramakrishna, the gardener that he had spoken to several years earlier. And thus was his first meeting, really. He asked, Ramakrishna said, "My name, who are you? What is your name?" "My name is Yogin," said the boy. And then he inquired about his family, his father's name, and it turned out that Ramakrishna understood. He knew his father very well. In fact, he used to go to his house quite often to listen to various readings from the Bhagavatam and other scriptures. His family were religious and orthodox. Immediately, Ramakrishna recognized the spiritual worth of this young boy, and he said in his usual style, "Come again, come again." Ramakrishna's way of saying, you have to come again. You must. He didn't require much persuasion. He was attracted immediately to Sri Ramakrishna. And he developed a religious tendency on the top of the one he had in his early life. Even in his early childhood, after receiving the sacred thread, he began to spend much more time in meditation and in worship. And he would get a great deal of joy from reading the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and other scriptures. And he was very fond of listening to devotional singing, kirtan, and so on, and also the recitation of the Bhagavatam. And sometimes he would help his father pick flowers for the worship. It's quite possible that on more than one occasion, actually, he would have unwittingly met or seen Sri Ramakrishna on the premises of Dakshinaswara. He was sent to missionary school in the early days, and although he knew that his academic studies would ultimately be of no real value to him, he opted instead to go and get a job. So he left for Kanpur with his father's consent and looked for a job. His uncle was staying there in Kanpur, but he didn't really manage to get anything, and so ended up spending most of his time in meditation, japa, worship, religious devotion, earnestly seeking the Lord. The spiritual bent of his mind concerned his family, and the way out for any family is, let us see if we can persuade him to be married, knowing that he would refuse because already he'd been infused with the ideas of monasticism from Sri Ramakrishna. Not only that, but he had this bent toward it from early days anyway. But his father wrote to his brother-in-law in Kanpur and said, we have to bring him home. We can say that his mother is ill and he'll come rushing home. In the meantime, we'll arrange his marriage. And that's precisely what happened. So naturally, the young boy raced home, and only to find the trick, and he was devastated. And he would refuse, and it was only because the family had arranged everything with the prospective father-in-law, and the mother with tears in her eyes begged, please, please, for my sake, won't you do this? And so people usually get married to find happiness, but Yogin's marriage really was to please his mother. And he was so ashamed of this event. He was so devastated that the course of his life might change now, that he stayed away from Dakshinaswara and stayed away from Sri Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna kept calling him, come, 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 and all to no effect. And eventually he found an excuse. Previously, Yogin had been given or borrowed some money from the priest at Dakshinaswara, and it was a small amount, and it seemed he hadn't really returned this, and on this pretext, the master contacted him and said, words to the effect, shame on you, I thought you were more truthful than that, and look, you see, this money needs to be returned, see what you've done. And Yogin was extremely upset by this. His reputation spoiled. He determined, let me go and settle the matter. And then that's the last I will see of Dakshinaswara. But he went there and he was seen by the master. And the master, with his cloth under his arm, raced toward him and settled his mind on the issue. And he settled his mind in this way, saying that a man gave you money to buy certain articles, and you have neither returned the balance nor even sent a word when you return it. But when I see you now, I see that what if you are married? What does it matter? I too am married, am I not? What is there to be afraid of in that? If you have the grace of this place, meaning himself, of course, then even 100,000 marriages will be powerless to affect you. And if you want to live a family life and realize God at the same time, then bring your wife here at once, and I'll make you both fit for spiritual life. And if you want to renounce worldly life and attain God, I'll make that possible too. And if she wants to do that, I'll make that possible too. Everything I'll make possible. And Yogan was absolutely stupefied by this. And his whole mindset was uplifted. And he left with a bright ray of hope in his mind. Was this why he thought the master had accused him of this penury? Just to inveigle him to come and lift the dead weight from his mind. And then the master, taking Yogin's hand, escorted him to his room. And when Yogi referred to the payment of the balance of the money, the master hardly knew anything about it. He wouldn't even listen. It wasn't important or significant. So great was the master that he was able to read the mind and adapt all of his sorry, I lost the broadcast temporarily, and was able to adapt his teaching method to that of his disciple. Just as Jesus had inspired and set the example for his disciples, his own disciples, in terms of service by washing their feet. Anyway, the marriage was a little fragile because, naturally, Yogan kept to his internal vow of continence. And so he managed to spend a lot of time with Sri Ramakrishna. On one occasion, he was, after supper, he set his bed down in Sri Ramakrishna's room. He was always quite a light sleeper, and he woke up in the middle of the night only to see that Ramakrishna's bed was unoccupied. Yogan thought, I wonder where he is. His chamber pot is still here. He went outside, and then it occurred to him, here's the master who espouses that we should be chaste, who assures the whole company of the lust and gold, women and gold, lust and greed. And yet, I wonder if he has secretly gone to visit his spouse in the Nahabat, in the music tower. And so Yogan goes to the music tower and waits. And at that moment, the master comes from the direction of the Panchavati and sees him. Now, instead of being upset or anything like that about this man's doubt, he admires him and says, well done, more or less. He says, you see, you have to test the Guru. Day and night test him like the money changers test their money. Such is the great, great status of this great Guru, Sri Ramakrishna. So that was the first instance that Yogan remembers with great shame and carried with him for the rest of his days. And he learned a lesson that he should not really doubt the master in any way. There was no greater master, no greater guru than this Sri Ramakrishna. And then with regard to things to eat, the master had given strict dietary rules for the young boys, looking carefully after them like a mother cares for her children. And he watched over his disciples and their spiritual practices, their sleeping, their eating habits. And he approved of eating substantially at lunchtime, but did not approve of the same kind of meal in the evening. Large quantities at night were discouraged. And one day the master asked Yogan, what do you eat at night? Bread made from 1 pound of flour and half a pound of potato curry, said Yogan. And immediately the master said, my goodness, I don't need your service. I can't afford to provide such a large quantity of food every day. You better go home and eat before coming here now. in the future. And so from then on, Yogin adheres strictly to the master's advice on what to eat, the rules regarding that. And even drinking water in someone else's house, he was reluctant to do that. But one morning, he ate a little breakfast at home, and then he left for Calcutta with the master. And Ramakrishna visited several places, but didn't ask Yogin to eat anything, as he knew his strict observance about taking food. But in the evening at Balaram Basu's house, the master asked Balaram to feed Yogin. And the master also knew that Yogin, being strictly orthodox too, but he had already eaten sweets and fruits as prasad. And on previous occasions, he was accustomed to that. Balaram immediately took Yogin to the dining hall and fed him sumptuously. But even though the master frequently passed in and out of spiritual ecstasy, he was still able to keep a vigilant watch on the mental and physical conditions of his disciples. I'm reading this directly, by the way, and making commentary as I go, from the book God Lived With Them, the life stories of 16 monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna by Swami Chetananda. It was a great education to live with Sri Ramakrishna, because every single act of his had some meaning. On one occasion, the master was agitated because he had not received the food given that was supposed to be shared by the temple authorities. And his share had not been sent to his room. And this irregularity disturbed him a lot, so he went to the temple. He went to the office there to inquire about it. And of course, they were a little embarrassed, and they immediately sent the master's portion to the room. And Yogin wondered, here's such a great spiritual master, but still, he must be attached to his body a little bit, or he must be, his diet restrictions and concern about this, it must be from his rural background and so on and so forth. It strikes me that Yogin overanalyzed a little bit too much and doubted from that. So in spite of all that, he still has these remnant tendencies. And until Ramakrishna explained to him, he said, look, you see, Rani Rasmani has bequeathed her large estate to the service of this temple, so that their offerings may be distributed among devotees and sadhus. And that part of the offering which comes to this room is taken only by devotees who come here with yearning for God. And so the gift of the Rani Rasmani is turned to good account. But what these people are doing often is they're selling the food at the market, and some even feed their mistresses with it. And I fight with the temple officials, he said, for the share that comes here, so that Rani Rasmani's objectives may at least be partially fulfilled and honored. And so Yogin discovered that every single small activity of the master had a deep significance and was a teaching moment and a learning moment for him. There were many, many examples given in the life of Yogin where he learned about the preciseness of things and learned a balance. The soft-hearted nature of Yogin was adjusted when Sri Ramakrishna found some cockroaches amongst a bundle of his clothing and instructed Yogin, please take this and kill the cockroaches. And Yogin took the clothes outside, shook them, and let the cockroaches go free. Thinking our master wouldn't notice any of this, the master asked, did you kill them? And he said, I let them free. And the master rebuked him. You have to adhere to everything I say. And he learned two lessons. Firstly, there's a tendency among some spiritual devotees to be so soft, so delicate in their approach that they forget to be assertive. And so people take advantage of them. And the lesson is that spiritual people are not necessarily fools. You have to avoid being a fool. On one occasion, there was Yogin was traveling on the boat, and there were people on the boat who raised all kinds of potential scandals against Sri Ramakrishna. That he was somebody who lived in the lap of luxury, lay on a bed, and this and that, all kinds of things. And initially, Yogin got very upset and agitated. And then he thought, so what? The master is so tall in his spiritual stature. It would mean nothing to him. What would he care? And so with great pride of his spiritual accomplishment, he went and told the master the whole story. The master said, what? You should defend the guru at all costs. And then he quoted some scripture in relation to that you either cut the person's head off even, or you leave the place, but you do not just sit quiet. So the mild-mannered yogin, the introverted, withdrawn yogin, who was also could challenge authority, who could also raise up a doubt, it seems, who was also very, very independent. This was the dual character of the person. He learned a good lesson from this. On another occasion, it so happened that a woman of ill fame would come to take her bath in the Ganga at the Dakshinaswar temple hut. On her way back, she would bow down to the master from a distance and sometimes would talk a little. And some villagers of Dakshinaswar had noticed it, and they began to remark about it. And of course, we know the gossip spreads faster than the gospel itself. Listening to the village gossip, Yogin firmly protested. The master's character is pure and stainless, he said. And if you have doubts, why don't you investigate? And so a villager secretly went to the woman and asked if the gossip was true. And she was shocked and said to the man, look, I may make my living in a shameful way, but I am not so mean as to tarnish the character of a God-man. You have no right to spread gossip or vilify the character of my beloved master. And the villager returned to his friends and reported what he had heard from the woman. And when Yogin told the master what had happened, Sri Ramakrishna said, in contrast to the previous example, when Yogin said it, he said, some foolish people say so many things. Why do you listen to them? Just dismissing it like that. And this time the master taught the yogin to ignore the endless gossip of worldly people, for otherwise it would drag his mind from God to the worldly plane. On the one occasion, a judgment has to be made about the reaction that you'll give. Defending truth and righteousness. On the other, a balance between foundless gossip. The delicate balance that we all have to make. On another occasion, Yogin was sent to collect some candles from Girish Chandra Ghosh. Girish Chandra Ghosh, he found him to be drunk and then abusive of Ramakrishna, swearing at him, cursing, and so on, alternating with bowing down and great love and devotion. And Yogin was a little frightened by this. He'd never come across a drunken devotee at all. And anyway, he took the candles back to Dakshinaswar and reported the matter to the master. And instead of the master showing any indignation or criticism of Girish, he rather said, you see, you have seen his bad side, how he scolded me and swore. But did you also not see his good side? How much love, devotion he had for me, and how he bowed down to me. Girish is a special class of devotee, a very high class, but his path is different from yours. And so, marking out a different path for each one of his devotees. And when we study the life, you see, of these great saints, these great apostles of Ramakrishna, we learn more about than about the character that we are studying, namely the apostle. We're also learning something about the master. Yogin served the master, and in the days of the Kashipur garden house, or the days when Ramakrishna contracted the cancer of the throat, he was one of those who diligently attended at the risk of his own health. He already had some health problems, Yogin had. And he labored day and night, and it told on his health as well. But he continued to serve the master with his heart and with soul. And since, of course, he was also very austere, he neglected his body. That was kind of the story throughout his life. In spite of the fatal disease, Sri Ramakrishna gave, of course, final shape to the future order in Kashipur, and he made Narendra the leader of his young disciples. And one day, Gopal the elder brought ochre cloths, 12 pieces, along with mala beads, and the master distributed them, and Yogin was one of those who was included. Significantly, 8 or 9 days before his passing away, Ramakrishna asked Yogin to bring the Bengali almanac to read all the events of each day and the positions of the stars and so on. And when Yogin finished reading about the 16th August, 1886, the master told him to stop there, put the almanac back in its proper place, and of course, Sri Ramakrishna, who had elected to pass away on this day, exactly passed away at 1:02 in the morning on the same auspicious day in August that he had selected. Yogin was one of the few disciples who was male disciples who was close to the mother. In fact, the mother's first issue of mantra diksha to a disciple was to Yogin. We shall hereafter, of course, call him Swami Yogananda, because as he spends the time with mother and goes on pilgrimage, he eventually comes back to the Baranagar Math, and there, like the others, he then takes this sannyasa. You may ask what happened to his wife. Well, his wife was a chaste woman, and she lived her life as a nun, and that is why the comments about the eunuch were made in fun at Purnananda monastery. But a few weeks of passing away of Sri Ramakrishna, the Holy Mother, along with Yogin and others, goes on a pilgrimage to assuage her grief. And first they stop at Dargah, and then after visiting Varanasi and Ayodhya, they go to Vrindavan. And there, Yogin witnesses the extraordinary transformation in the Holy Mother. She, on occasion, goes into ecstasy and she starts looking exactly like the Master, verifying the fact that she and the Master are one and the same. This wonderful, wonderful vision and this wonderful sight of this phenomena, it was extraordinary. And so Yogin, or Yogananda, was the first one really to recognize this inherent specialness and this divinity in the Holy Mother. Because she looked like, to all intents and purposes, just an ordinary woman. Nothing that extraordinary about her. But when you saw her in this state, it was so evident. Now, the Master hadn't given Yogin any mantra. And in Vrindavan, where the mother stayed for about a year, along with Yogin and others, she had a vision. The mother had a vision of the Master who appeared to her. Initially, she thought it was some kind of hallucination, but it persisted. Look, I haven't given Yogin a mantra. You please give it. And she objected. I don't even speak to Yogin, she said. So how can I initiate him? And the Master, with her at the time of initiation, received instructions both of them had received. Yogin had received them in a vision, and the mother had also received them in a vision. And the master said, look, to make you more comfortable, do it in the presence of a woman devotee, so which he actually did. And so Yogin actually is the first Mantra Diksha disciple of Holy Mother, and really starts the whole process of the mother as an initiating guru. It starts her transformation in this role of universal mother. And from there on, of course, he's very dedicated to the Holy Mother, serving her, living with her, traveling with her in various places. And there, of course, in Vrindavan, as I said, the Holy Mother had many, many spiritual experiences. We are all surprised, he says, to see the spirit of Sri Ramakrishna united with hers. It was unique. We then realized that the Master and the Mother were one in essence, and though appearing in separate forms, it is not said in the scriptures, or is it not said, that Lord, thou art man, thou art woman. Hari. The Master told me many times that there was no difference between him and the Mother. The Holy Mother even passed 2 solid days in a state of superconsciousness. And this great transformation took place there. And she identified really as Radha, naturally in this place of Vrindavan. Incidentally, I should tell you that the Master himself identified Yogin as an incarnation of Arjun from the Mahabharata. Anyway, after a year, they journey on, and wherever the mother went, he went. They stayed at Hardwar for a few days. Then Yogin became ill, became sick, and then he has a vision. And so the vision was that I would have put an end to your life, says this vision, but I'm helpless. On the order of your Guru, Paramahansa Deva, I'm leaving you. However, you must offer some rasgolas to this woman, and he points to a goddess wearing a red cloth. The next morning, Yogin's fever abates. Now he finds that when they're visiting all the deities there in Jaipur, as it turns out, he saw a goddess with a red cloth, whom he recognized as the same deity he had seen during his high fever. She was actually Sitala, the goddess of disease, and Yogin brought a small quantity of rasgolas, offers it to her, and fulfilling, therefore, the vision that he had. And from Jaipur, the Holy Mother and her party, they go to Allahabad or Prayag, confluence of the Ganga and the Yamuna, and then they return to Kolkata. The Holy Mother stays at Balaram Babu's house for a couple of weeks, and then left for Karmarpuka with Yogin and Golapma. And Yogin then returns to Brahmanagore Monastery, where he joins his brothers, and there he takes his formal monastic vows. In the Baranago Monastery, as I mentioned, they were intensely studying scriptures, but Yogananda wasn't really inclined towards study. He was more inclined toward meditation and the withdrawn life of spirituality. And so he loved to be in solitude. And he would practice japam and meditation for many, many long hours. Sometimes he would leave the monastery and practice austerities on the bank of the Ganga. And due to his intense fasting, Yogananda's body was lean. It was naturally lean anyway, but it became very, very slim. His eyes were bright and luminous. And of course, he used to beg his food. And once Some village women who were carrying water from the Ganga saw Yogananda seated under a banyan tree. They were immediately impressed by his appearance, and their love and sympathy welled up for him. And they began to inquire about his background and so on and so forth. To avoid everything, Yogananda, instead of speaking in Bengali, he replied in Hindi, and they thought, oh, this person is a rogue. I don't know. I don't know if it's a slur on Hindi-speaking people, but there it was. They thought that he was either a Hindustani hemp smoker or a cheat, and they left. Now, as is customary for mendicants, he went to beg for food one day. He arrived at one thatched cottage, and a poor woman was sweeping the house, and seeing the young man, full of vigor actually and health, and looking handsome actually, she berated him. You're a young man, why don't you go and earn a living? And she chased him away basically with a broom. And then, of course, this was part of the fun of relating these stories back at the Baragaro Math for everybody's fun and laughter. Sometimes he would repeat his mantram day and night, almost non-stop, and sometimes this caused severe headaches. These headaches were cured by Girish Chandra Ghosh, who had some inkling about homeopathy, and he gave him some homeopathic medicine. But Swami Shuddhananda, who lived with Swami Yogananda for some time, said this. He said, Yogin Maharaj was so absorbed in meditation most of the time that his face would always look serene and luminous. Even when he would come from his bath, one would feel that he had just come out of his deep meditation. In November 1888, Yogananda, he goes to Puri with the Holy Mother, and he stays there for 3 months. And then in February 1889, he goes to Karmapuka with the Holy Mother. And she stayed there for a year, but during that time, he departs on pilgrimage and visits other places, Dergah, Gaya, Prayag again, Chitrakoot, Omkarnath, and so on. And after returning, he falls ill again. This is a recurring sequel, that he falls ill because of his austerity and fasting, his great digestive problems that he has. But his disciples rush to Prayag. This is the depth of feeling in this fellowship, and they take care of him until he recovers. Now, he was also a great organizer. And so in 1892, apart from anything else, returning to the monastery, which had now been moved from Baranagar actually to Lambazar, and he lives there for several months. And he devoted himself primarily to serving the mother. It was all the mother. On one occasion, it was Swami Sharananda Sharat had said that none loved me as did Yogan. Sorry, I'm changing the subject. The Holy Mother says this. None loved me as did Yogan. If anybody would give him any money, he would save it, saying, Mother will use it for her pilgrimage. The other monks would tease him for staying in this household full of women. And he would ask me to address him as Yoga, says the Holy Mother. And Yogananda was so respectful towards Holy Mother that he would not salute her by touching her feet. And when the mother would leave the place, he would touch that spot with his head. And asked about this strange behavior, Yogananda replied, What? I don't have the audacity to keep the mother standing and waiting for me so that I can bow down to her. And I'm pausing there because it's just an astonishing event, an astonishing attitude, astonishing spirit of service that he has and love for this Holy Mother. Sharananda, Sharat Maharaj would have said, you see, sometimes I can't understand Swamiji, Swami Vivekananda, his moods fluctuate and so on. And Yogananda says, every word, be close to the Holy Mother, because every word that she says is absolute truth and is absolutely valid and unquestioned. I tell you one thing, he said, cling to Holy Mother. Whatever she says, that is right. And Yogananda then took Shalananda after saying this to Holy Mother, and gradually the latter became an attendant to the Holy Mother. We often think that Swami Shalananda was the watchdog of Holy Mother and looked after the Holy Mother. But it is really Swami Yogananda that brings Swami Shalananda into that role. Yogananda led an ideal life, says this book. He taught by his example. He did not lecture or do any spectacular work. And although married and born into a rich family, he demonstrated how to practice renunciation and purity. He was an uncompromising monk. He shunned everything that took his mind away from the Master. And during the last years of his life, he would visit Girish and talk about the Master. He presided several times over the weekly meetings of the Ramakrishna Mission, because when Swami Vivekananda set up the Ramakrishna Mission in 1897, Ramakrishna Society in 1897, he made Swami Brahmananda the president, and he made Swami Yogananda the vice president. And he had an enormous organizing capacity. The first ever birth celebration of Sri Ramakrishna was organized by Swami Yogananda. And Swami Yogananda organized the reception that was given to Swami Vivekananda on his return from the West. And so, although he was shy, although he preferred to be in solitude, although he was highly meditative, although he was extremely austere in his habits, his austerities were something to be reckoned with. Still, he was a good organizer and exhibited huge amount of compassion. And so during the last years of his life, he would visit Girish, he would talk about the Master. And as I say, he presided several times of the weekly meetings of the Ramakrishna Mission, because Vivekananda valued his judgment and his foresight. In 1898, he took Yogananda by boat to the site of the now current Belomat, the property that he had purchased for the purpose of establishing a permanent monastery there. And although Yogananda was quite ill at that point, he was pleased to see the beautiful land that Swamiji had purchased for the permanent home of the order. And while Yogananda was actually bedridden even, Swami Adbhutananda Latu Maharaj came to see him at the Holy Mother's house at Bosparalayam. And Yogananda said to him, this illness, he says, will never be cured. He knew the end was near. The doctors advised me to take, and I had a chuckle when I saw this, pomegranate juice, luchi fried bread, and catfish soup. And Yogananda said, they have no sense. Imagine prescribing all this food. Even if it's good for me, where will a monk procure this food? And he says this, how can a monk procure such expensive food like that, meant for rich aristocrats? They have money and people to prepare such delicacies, these doctors, even today they have it. But we are monks, we have none except God. We live on alms. So that kind of luxury doesn't befit us. What do you think? Adbhutananda replies, what do you mean, brother? When one is sick, he needs a special diet. I don't find any objection to your taking that kind of food. I know, but who will supply it? No, we'll supply everything, says Adbhutananda. And Yogananda says, I know that, but you see, Holy Mother wants my wife to come and prepare all these things for me. What is your opinion? I'm a monk. Shall I have to accept service from my wife? I can't agree to this proposal. My mind is reluctant to yield to this. But Adbhutananda says, when Mother approves it, there should not be any problem. And Yogananda eventually concedes to this pure woman who nurses him. Yogananda knew, of course, he wouldn't live very long. At last he obeyed mother's will, and during his last illness, Yogananda suffered from fever and blood dysentery. His whole body was emaciated, his voice was feeble. And one day he said about the advent of the Master something very significant. He said, "There have always been various religious paths, countless scriptures, holy places in every country. But in spite of that, why is there a decline in religion? Because in the course of time, all ideals become lost. Therefore, God incarnates himself to try or to explain the hidden mystery of religion and to show the ideal." And on another occasion, he said, "By the grace of the Master, I have attained to much jnana, much knowledge, and much bhakti devotion, that I am unable to express it all." And when Yogananda's own parents came to see him in this condition, he said, "I pray, may you attain devotion." As Yogananda lay ill, Vivekananda said, "Yogan, you get well, let me die instead." And Yogan, you are our crest jewel. Swami Niranjananda said, one day Girish's sister said to Yogananda, "Yogan, why don't you ask Holy Mother to tell Master to give you back your health?" And Yogananda replied, "Sister, you don't know their ways. They do what is right, and my request will not change their will." And Yogananda never prayed to Sri Ramakrishna to cure his disease. He was, after all, an illumined soul, a free soul, having gone through all the wonderful training and terrible, terrible austerities on one occasion, only taking just the pieces of bread soaked in water for prolonged periods of time that completely ruined his digestion. But 6 months before Yogananda's death, Sri Ramakrishna appeared before him, and Yogananda said, "Master, I don't want to be born again. The lesson of this life is enough for me. Please give me final liberation." But the Master replied, "No, you'll have to come once more." "No, I won't come," Yogananda demanded. "Please relieve me forever." Immediately, Ramakrishna disappeared. Yogananda went through 6 months of physical suffering, hoping that the Master would grant his request. Knowing Yogananda's resolution, it was Girish who at last said to him, "Brother, don't you know that you have been suffering terribly these last 6 months? Your pain is causing pain to all of us. Please agree to the will of the Master. Don't refuse to come back with the Master. Look here, Yogan." What does this mean? That he's not coming back as an individual, he's coming back along with the next incarnation, the next edition of the incarnation. And you see the characteristic of the Ishvara Kotis is that they go back actually to the realm of the incarnation, in this case Sri Ramakrishna Loka. And so ultimately he yields to the Lord's will, and they beg him, "Don't refuse to come back with the Master. Look here, don't seek nirvana. Don't think of the Master as pervading the entire universe, the sun, the moon. Think of the Master as he used to be to us. And thus thinking of him, go to him." At this, Yogananda said, "What have been suffering in bed for the last 6 months? All right, let the Master's will be done. I am his servant. Whatever he asks me to do, I will do." And so saying, Yogananda fully resigned himself to the Master. So he passed away in Samadhi at 3:10 p.m. on 28th March 1899. Before his passing away, he said to Holy Mother, "Mother, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and Sri Ramakrishna have come to take me." In the morning, while performing worship, Holy Mother saw that the Master had come to take Yogananda. And when Yogananda breathed his last, Brahmachari Krishnalal, who was there, cried out. Holy Mother was upstairs and realized from this what had happened. She also burst into tears and said, "My Yogan has left me. Who will now look after me? And because Yogananda was the first disciple of the master to die, Mother remarked with a deep sigh, a brick has slipped from the structure. Now the whole thing will come down. Before the body of Yogananda was taken to Kashi Mitra's cremation ground in North Kolkata, Swamiji waved the light and offered flowers and sweets as part of the ritual, but he couldn't, so stunned was he, go to the cremation ground himself. And Brahmananda and other disciples and devotees went in a procession and cremated their most beloved brother. And grief-stricken, Swamiji did not go to Sri Ramakrishna's shrine for 3 days. And he remarks, a beam is down, and now the rafters will fall one after another. And so it was. So just before Yogananda's death, Swami Shivananda had asked him, Yogan, do you remember the master? And Yogananda replies, yes, I remember the master. More, even more, much more. A touching end to a very sacred, holy, and distinguished life. Yogananda was very withdrawn and shy, but he was also assertive. And he could express his doubts. He often may have challenged Swami Vivekananda, expressing, maybe a little tactfully, even as vice president, you see, I have doubts that you are actually doing the Master's will. He was advocating prayer, intense individual spiritual life and practice, and you are advocating this service and so on. I'm not sure if the two are compatible. And he was quite open in expressing it. Such was his blatant honesty that he had learned. And of course, Vivekananda reacted to this in a sorrowful way. Because, of course, despite that, Swami Yogananda and all of the apostles had absolute allegiance to their great leader, Swami Vivekananda, seeing in him this divine mission of Ramakrishna's moving forward, developing. And so Swami Yogananda was really an intrinsic part of this, being persuaded by Swami Vivekananda, being persuaded absolutely. The Master can make a infinite Vivekanandas if he likes. And the Master, how do you know it's not the Master? So this back and forth went on. But ultimately, it was resolved, and it was very clear that this whole movement is this divine incarnation, Ramakrishna's expression in this way. This is therefore the short life of Swami Yogananda. And if you want to read what I have just said in greater detail, that is the book, God Lived With Them, Life Stories of 16 Monastic Disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, contained here. And so today we honor this great light, one of the 16 lights taken from the great Paschal light, if you want to put it in Christian terminology now, in view of the season, that was Sri Ramakrishna. We can easily see the concept and the similarities of incarnations during this period of this Holy Week, and particularly starting today, carrying on till tomorrow, and then Saturday and Sunday, reliving the events of the incarnation of Jesus. And even after the fact, we see how Sri Ramakrishna appears to the Holy Mother and appears in visions, and the same thing, of course, happens after Jesus' death and burial. We see the great messages that these messengers bring. And we are assured by this message, you will be born one more time, to Yogin, that we are assured of a continuing, ongoing, whenever the requirement is there, whenever, from age to age, the need is there to adjust dharma. That is, whenever a dharma appears, we have this great, great reassurance that not only the Lord descends, but brings a whole cortege of accompanying great, great souls to endorse and multiply his message. Such is the life of Swami Yogananda. And so with that, we leave this special examination, not really examination, it's actually a rereading. It's a reading and rereading of this life. And that's all that I have done here this evening. But I hope you've gotten some insights. And the purpose of getting insights into these great souls is to see how we can be inspired to emulate their example. We cannot continue our journey without doing some intense spiritual practice according to our resources, according to our capacity, but according to our sincerity too. And we should endeavor not to deviate. And when our spiritual practice lapses, we should resolve to pick it up quickly and carry on. And the more we do that, the more the Lord's grace is opened up to us. A small poem in relation both to the day and also to Swami Yogananda, which I can explain, came out as a thought. It says, eternally perfects some are born. And so Swami Yogananda was one of such. Bliss of yoga at their feet. These monastic names have a meaning because he who has the bliss of this yoga, so he was a great yogi and enjoyed the bliss of this practice of yoga. Their aura lifts the living air when you see what those who knew him, how they were inspired by his presence. A great tribute to the man. There was one such tribute. Let's see if I can locate it here in another book. He was such a great saint that it fills one with awe to belong even as the youngest member of the order that contained him, was the remark. Swami Yogananda commanded great love and respect from all the lay and monastic disciples of the Ramakrishna order. And then it goes on, he was one of those whom the master spotted out as Ishwara Kotis, eternally perfect, one of the souls which are never in bondage, but now and then come to this world of ours for guiding humanity Godwards. So their aura lifts the living air. To live and love so much is rare. Teacher, that is Ramakrishna, taught that path of truth should not make a pleasing fool. Non-injury has its sacred place. You can, on occasion, kill cockroaches. Birth and death we have to face. Examine, test, express your doubt. With critical mind, establish trust. And Swami Yogananda had this critical mind that he could employ, which could be useful, but also could be also a lesson that we can learn. Conviction done, prepare to change. All views for new ones to exchange. That's the example for us. In the midst of austere practices that take their toll on body health, good cheer and love be sustained. He was always cheerful about it. Faith in mother's grace obtained. To wash the feet with heart's blood. Swami Vivekananda remarked, if I had been there with Jesus, I would have shed my own heart's blood. I would have washed and bathed him with my own heart's blood, not just with water. To sup in close-knit fellowship, that is, to dine, as it were, on the spiritual food together in holy company and fellowship that was missed when he was the first one to fall. True saint will give their very all for the least until last curtain call. And so that was thought today in relation to this. We finish off now. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. And have now a happy Easter.